Good morning, crime community. I'm here to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. I went down the deep hole a little bit and it's very confusing. Edgar Allan Poe is the master of the macabre. Who would have ever thought? Some influences for his writing was by Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Maybe that was The Bride of Frankenstein. It was about a woman who was brought back to life. That was Poe's whole theme of writing. There's a guy who influenced him named Devere, Deverre. Has to do with Shakespeare, De Vere. They think De Vere wrote Shakespeare's work. I don't know. Another guy named Defoe, Defoe, wrote Robinson Crusoe. I haven't verified that yet. I don't know. Stoke Newington. They say that's a place in London where Ozzy Osbourne was born and all the other members of Black Sabbath. So if Poe was born there too, it must be an interesting place. Poe's public image was distorted. He had a guy in his life, like Manson had a guy in his life named Vincent Bugliosi. We'll get to that in a minute. Poe's public image about him being an alcoholic was not really true. He overdrank, but then he'd go without drinking for over a year. Gambling addict, possibly from the pressures from his wealthy father and all his wealthy peer friends that he had to try to keep up with. And his dad eventually wouldn't pay for his gambling habits, and his dad never legally adopted him either. You could do a deep dive into John Allen that would go on forever. I have no idea. He was a landowner and a tobaccoist. Poe watched his wife die of tuberculosis, which inspired him to write Murder on the Rue Morgue. When he was like 25 or 27, she was like 13 or 15. The woman in Poe's life is a very confusing subject. Some of his contemporaries at that time, around the 1830s or whenever it was, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen. That reminds me of Uncle Bob's play with Danny Kaye, always doing that type of work. Those were his contemporaries. And now we get to the Vincent Bugliosi of the Edgar Allan Poe situation. There's a guy named Rufus Griswold. Rufus Griswold was the bug of the Manson trial. What did he do? He was Poe's top contender for the top spot of being the top editor of magazines in America. Rufus wrote a 35-page memoir that destroyed Poe's career, calling him an alcoholic, a psychotic, and everything else that you didn't want to be called. He was later proved to be a fraud. But the damage to Poe was already done. So some other inspirations that Poe had were Sherlock Holmes inspired Poe to write The Fall of the House of Usher. Then there was another magazine called Burton's Messenger magazine. Poe was the editor of that magazine. When he first started there, the magazine had 5,000 subscriptions. And when he finished there, he had 40,000 subscriptions, was a lot in 1835, compared to now where it's international around the world. Poe's wife, this gets really confusing, Annabel Lee. Poe believed Poe believed his writings were the power of dreams, his subconscious mind, or his childhood trauma that caused these mental health issues, which I can relate to. I have a lot of childhood trauma. All writings were dreamlike or nightmare-like. Some things that inspired him to write from these dreamlike states, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Raven, which is the most famous thing he ever wrote in the 1840s. Put him on the top of the list. Guess what Poe earned for writing The Raven? $9. Okay, so let's move on now. We got the Poe House in Baltimore, which is a museum I'd like to go to. Doubt if I'll ever make it. Poeinbaltimore.org. Poe's mother was the Raven. For I shall never tell for who my heart shall beat for thee, a telltale heart. Who did he love? I guess it's a secret. All Poe's women haunted him. Black plague was around everywhere. people were dying, mourning was celebrated. It was actually a place to go to the gravesite with your girlfriend or your wife. It was very commonplace for dating. Poe's women, yes, this gets confusing. Frances Osgood, Sarah Whitman, Helen Whitman, Anne Richmond, Nancy Richmond. Anne Richmond was the ghost of Sissy, his wife. He married his first cousin. That was his wife. He was around 30, she was around 16. Sarah Elmira Foister Shelton. Elmira, yeah, he wrote stuffs about Annabel Lee and Elmira. Poe's magazine that he never launched was called The Stylist. He should have had his own magazine if it wasn't for Rufus Griswold. What else can I say about this? Not too much more. Oh, a toast to Lenore. There was a guy who he's the Poe toaster. If you do look up who the Poe toaster is, it's really interesting. This guy went for decades to Poe's grave and left 3 roses there every year for like 2 decades. Nobody ever knew who he was. Amazing, huh? Okay, this gets into his relationships now. His mother, Poe's mother, Eliza Poe, English-born actress and singer and dancer. She performed on stage. She was well known in the acting theater world for doing comedic and dramatic acting. She would sing and dance and then die on stage and then get up and get applause. And then she ended up having TB and dying right in front of Edgar at 5 years old. So that set his whole life in motion for women living and dying right in front of him. His father, David Poe, abandoned Poe, and Eliza went on tour with the children, William, Henry, and Edgar, and Rosalie. She died at 24 in Richmond, Virginia in 1811. Poe was 5 years old. His wife, Virginia, died of TB at 24 as well. Frances Allen, his foster mother, her death in 1829 was very significant. Poe was 20 years old. She died of mental health issues. Virginia Eliza Clem Poe, wife and cousin, we talked about her. She was suffered for 5 years. Poe had to take care of her for 5 years before she died. Do you think this affected his life? Annabel Lee, the Raven, Ligeria, Miriam Muddy Clem, aunt and mother-in-law, Virginia, mother, Aunt Poe's mother-in-law. She had a maternal influence close until 1849, until her death. And then finally we have, I think I'm lost here, but I get lost all the time, so you'll have to forgive me. The last person is Nancy Anna Richmond, the confidant. Married woman, Poe had a deep platonic attraction to her. A poem for Annie. She helped present his legacy. She helped preserve his legacy, which apparently not a lot of people did. In this other book I have here, there's a whole list of all the writers that Poe critiqued. Maybe we'll get into that in another day or two. This is just an introduction to Edgar and his life and what it's all about. We'll just have to keep reading and learning. Have a nice day.